This morning, I'm going to try some coffee from a country not usually known for its Arabica, Thailand. Like much of Southeast Asia, Thailand's coffee industry has historically been dominated by Robusta. 30 years ago, Thailand was producing just 500 tons of Arabica per year, less than 1% of its Robusta crop. During the 2000s, however, production steadily increased, and by the mid-2010s was over 8,000 tons a year. This at a time when overall coffee production was actually dropping. In other words, between 1990 and 2014, Arabica went from 1% of the Thai coffee crop to nearly a quarter. The Thai Arabica coffee heartland is in the north of the country, dominated by the provinces of Chiang Mai and Chiang Rai. Today's coffee comes from Omkoi district in the southwest of Chiang Mai province, not far from the border with Myanmar. The farm is owned by a woman named Sopa and called Sopa's Estate. As you can see in this picture from their Facebook page, there's a nice forested area, likely quite reminiscent of the highland forests of Ethiopia, where Arabica originated. The varietals grown there are Typica and Katwai. Typica is one of the oldest non-heirloom varieties of Arabica, deriving from the coffee that was grown in Yemen and then crossed to Indonesia around 1700. Katwai is a Brazilian hybrid that dates only back to the 1970s, when it was developed by crossing Mundo Novo and Caturra. Mundo Novo is a natural hybrid of Typica and Bourbon discovered in the 1940s, while Caturra is a natural Bourbon mutation discovered during World War I. So Katwai has pretty complicated genetics. The gist is, coffee scientists were trying to develop a varietal that would combine Mundo Novo's productivity with Caturra's size. Caturra is a dwarf mutation, which means that you can plant more trees per acre. Sopa's estate is located about 1,300 meters above sea level, which is towards the lower end of where the finest Arabica is grown from an altitude standpoint. So it will be interesting to see how this has affected the cup. Higher altitude coffees tend to be brighter and more acidic, whereas lower altitude coffees tend towards the mellower side. But this is also a medium light roast, which means that less of that brightness is going to have been roasted out of the beans. Maybe it's time to stop speculating and get to tasting. So here we go. Arabica coffee from northern Thailand. Medium grind, brewed in the V60. So it's not a heavy acid, certainly. But there is a nice little pop right there at the front. There's a little bit of a lime suggestion, definitely. It's sort of hard to characterize. It's definitely light. The profile is light, the flavor profile, the body is on the light side. Kind of a mild sweetness. I think the bag said honey. That's not an unfair characterization, definitely. It doesn't remind me as strongly of honey as some other coffees that I had. I had one from Ethiopia a few months ago that was basically tasted like tea with honey in it, to the extent that if you had told me that's what it was, I would have believed you. Yeah, the honey is definitely not as overt here, but it's this sweetness that is just a little on the syrupy side. which is good for this because I think the body is pretty light. But because you have that flavor character, the body fills out a little bit just with the flavor. This is a washed process, so you're gonna get a nice clean cup without that kind of heavy sweetness that you can get from the naturals or even the honey processed. Now, the bag said white grape. There's definitely a, slightly sweet, slightly acidic fruit character. To me, it feels a bit more like plum or maybe like a red grape. Obviously, the difference between a white grape and a red grape is minimal, but to me, it feels a little bit richer, if that's the word, than a white grape. But tasting notes are, of course, very subjective. I mean, undoubtedly, this is an excellent cup of coffee. It tastes very good. It is pretty subtle, I would say. Like the geisha that I discussed last time, you really don't get a lot of a taste that I think people typically identify as coffee. It's lighter. You really do not have many roast flavors in there. I'd say the profile is primarily fruity, and this isn't even a natural. So this is just, the beans and then the terroir. You're just getting kind of a fruity profile off of them. Kind of fruity and sweet and kind of tea-like. And I have seen that with some of those kind of Southeast Asian, Indian subcontinent into Indochina coffees before. I had some from Nepal, which is not a million miles from Thailand, that were pretty tea-like. And I would say that this is in that ballpark. It's quite light and delicate and not super acidic. It's not as tannic and drying as a tea would probably be, but just from the character on the palate, you don't really have that coffee bitterness because of the lighter roast and, I guess also just the character of these particular beans. Yeah, you basically have some acid over the top and then just kind of this delicate sweetness. So it is kind of like, a cup of tea with a little sugar in it. Maybe you kind of squeezed a lemon. It's pretty similar to that. And I would say no dairy to kind of give it that slightly heavier, creamier body. It is a pretty light body. There is, again, a little give back from, I guess, just some of the natural sweetness here. So it's not a watery body. It's not too light. It's light, but decent balance, I would say, in that body. So as this cools, I feel like I'm getting more of the tasting notes that are on the bag. So Paradise Roasters suggests white grape, honey, and lime. That's what they have on the bag. And I was kind of ready to say that my personal tasting notes were a little maybe heavier than that. I was going to say like plum and then, some kind of sweetness, but not necessarily honey, maybe like a cane sugar, and then maybe like black tea. But as this cools a bit, I do think it is cooling towards those tasting notes. And that's another thing to bear in mind as far as tasting goes, right? It's even temperature plays a key role as far as what you're tasting in a cup of coffee. And I've certainly had coffees before, and I would say this is to some extent one of them. It's not an extreme difference, but there are coffees where the flavor really morphs as they cool. So you start drinking them when they're maybe a 110 10-degree cup of coffee, and as it gets down to, 90, it starts tasting like something else. I wouldn't go that far with this, but I do think that it gets maybe a little lighter as it cools. It's starting to resemble a little more like a cup of tea that you would maybe have when you had a sore throat, So like, yeah, a cup of tea, a little honey in it, for soothing purposes. And it is kind of reminding me of that. There is still that citric acidity, little like a lime. This is a tough one to pin down for me. Some coffees are easier than others, especially when you're a novice. I certainly do not consider myself an expert on this front. I'm trying to work my way into it. I mean, this is basically the process on display of me trying to kind of learn, stuff that I'm talking about here. I've just, learned a lot of it fairly recently. So that's the journey, the Farab's Coffee Journeys. I don't quite want to call that honey. What is that? Well, now I've finished my cup of coffee, and I'm still not 100% sure how I want to characterize it. So, final tasting notes for me. I'm going to say lime, red grape, and then like warm sugar. Now, the distinction between red grape and white grape, and for that matter, the distinction between honey and warm sugar, is perhaps pretentiously minimal, and okay, guilty, And this is not to say that they're wrong. The whole thing about tasting notes is no one's wrong. You kind of taste what you taste, and it's a very subjective thing. And, it can totally depend on how the coffee was brewed, the temperature at which you drank it, any number of things. And everyone's experience can be different. So, tasting notes on a bag of coffee that you get at a coffee shop from a roaster, whatever, these are a suggestion. I think that when I started getting into specialty coffee, I kind of felt like I needed to taste what they had on the bag, and if I didn't, that meant that something was kind of wrong with me. And, I've since come to learn that that's not how it works. Is it the case that if our experiences are vastly different, maybe something happened? It's possible. Because, theoretically, at least, there should be some degree of consistency as far as the beans go. There should be one thing that they more or less taste like. And if we're completely different, if one person says that it's like a light body that, tastes like fruit, and one person says it's a very heavy body that tastes like, smoke and pipe tobacco, then there's probably an issue with one of us, or we just, accidentally had completely different coffees. Short of that, it is a very subjective thing. So, yeah, I think that our tasting notes are similar enough that there's no reason for either of us to be worried. I'm sure they're not, of course, nor should they be. But yeah, that was the experience that I had with it. Not quite as light, maybe, as they suggested. My experience with it was just a little deeper, I think, a little richer. That's how it kind of came across to me. It was definitely a pretty light, pretty delicate cup of coffee. Very pleasant, very easy to drink. Really no bitterness at all. And acidity present but not overwhelming. So again, that just makes it very easy to drink. You really don't have any kind of harshness on the palate at all that way. So, nice smooth cup of coffee. Does not really taste like the classic coffee profile. But a lot of specialty coffee doesn't. As we are learning here, I mean, I think a lot of what I've had on this channel, because of the nature of how I've been doing it, has not been that kind of coffee, a lot of lighter roasts, a lot of, kind of exotic stuff, more delicate cups of coffee. But yeah, it's very good, very drinkable. Again, not maybe explosively flavorful, but that's okay. Not many coffees are like explosively flavorful. Usually there's a couple of major notes that you get. I mean, the absolute best coffees that I've had, you can find like 5 different things going on, but most coffees aren't like that. So that is not a knock on this. But yeah, absolutely delicious and smooth, and a great way to start the day. So Thailand, nice cup of coffee. Soap is a state. Thank you for this coffee. That's it for this episode of Rob's Coffee Journeys, Thailand. Another successful journey. I'm not sure where exactly I'll be traveling to next. I know there's some coffee coming from, I think it's coming from Guatemala, but it's like a Jamaican Blue Mountain varietal. So that could be interesting. So that is one possibility. Other than that, I'll keep my eyes open for interesting origins, and, sooner or later, you'll see me again. Until next time.